Check, 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 check. Check, check. Check, check. Check, check. What?
Oh, I'm hitting the laser pointer. Got the mic. It might be a bit quiet. It might be a bit quiet. The mic might be a bit quiet.
But that's fixable. Check, check.
Yeah, there is a mixer. They tend to keep notes of Yeah, we're trying to figure out where to put the mic. My thought would be one in the front, one in the middle. I was thinking one in the front, one in the middle. That's just my guess. I'll go get the other two mics. I already checked all of this.
Check, check. Check, check.
Ist dieser Clip besser?
Check, check. Check, check. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Check, check. Check, check. Check, check.
right, everyone, we're going to get ready to get started soon, so please have a seat. Good evening, everyone. Did everyone make it okay in the rain today? Is it on? We're good? All right. Hello, I am Jamaica Jones. I am chair of this Human Trafficking Awareness Conference and program coordinator of UVL's Women's Center. I wear very many hats. I want to welcome you first to the University of Louisville and to the 9th Annual Human Trafficking Awareness Conference, hosted by the Women's Center and our student organization, Women for Women Student Board. The inauguration of the Human Trafficking Awareness Conference began in 2010 to raise awareness of human trafficking, to educate students and the community about the complex issue, and to encourage taking action to prevent it. This conference has brought in speakers at the local, statewide, national, and international levels, including stories from various survivors. Notable speakers have included new research on human trafficking, including Dr. Teresa Hayden and Dr. Jennifer Middleton from U of L's Human Trafficking Research Initiative out of the Kent School of Social Work, Carl Ralston, who is the president and founder of Remember New, an international nonprofit focusing on fighting the child sex trade, and a performance by Kentucky Opera studio artist Jill Phillips and Corey Beatty of Love is a Knife from the opera, A Woman in Morocco, which was inspired by this conference. Each year, the conference serves as the place where students in the community come together to work towards a world where individuals' human rights are no longer violated through sexual exploitation and human trafficking. We hope that our conference is a place where you can feel inspired to dig deep and closely examine the issues that are holding back forward progress in our state and across the world. This year's program, focusing on the sexual exploitation and human trafficking of youth, will include new research from our keynote speaker, Dr. Jennifer Cole from the University of Kentucky, and 2 breakout sessions with expert speakers. We will conclude our program with a survivor sharing their story and giving you, the audience, a call to action. In the ballroom next door, since this is a heavy topic, we will have counselors on hand if anybody feels like they need a space, break away, or become triggered. Modern-day slavery is not only an international problem. It happens right here in our community. If everyone in this state got empowered as much as they do when U of L and UK plays each year, we would see real change in this community, which brings me to our keynote speaker. Dr. Jennifer Cole is currently appointed as an assistant professor in the Department of Behavioral Science and the Center on Drugs and Alcohol Research at the University of Kentucky. She is also a faculty associate of the Center on Trauma in Children in the University of Kentucky. Her overarching research career goal is to investigate the intersection of interpersonal victimization and substance use or misuse, along with system responses to individuals with victimization experiences and substance use disorders. Dr. Cole was the principal investigator of an NIJ-funded study examining the impact of legislative reform in judicial decision-making related to sex trafficking of minors that was completed in 2018. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Cole.
Do you know how to pull it up? Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out on another dreary Kentucky winter day. Do I need to do something to pull this up? The PowerPoint? Yeah, thank you. Okay. Like Jamaica Jones said, I'm from the University of Kentucky. I hope you won't hold that against me. And I'm here to mainly talk about this research project that we ended in 2018. But to be able to do that, I need to make sure everyone's up to date on some of the issues related to this topic. Let's see. And will it go forward? Sorry, I should have rehearsed this before. I originally was going to talk about a case from Kentucky. I'm going to go over those couple of slides, and if we have time, I'll go back to that. I'm a little worried about having enough time to cover everything. Uh-oh. Okay, yeah, go one more. It's just very slow. You're going to have to put concerted effort this way. Okay, it's not working. Let's see. All right. You're going to look. So very quickly before I go into that, I just want to talk about, so I've been thinking and talking about sex trafficking of youth for several years now. And I'm going to tell you about some of the first questions that people have about this topic when they first start thinking about it, including me. One of them is, well, how common of a problem is it really? I mean, how many people are we talking about? Number two is, aren't trafficking victims necessarily foreign nationals? So are we mainly talking about people who are coming here from other countries? Okay. Okay. It's not talking. I don't have the touch, evidently. So isn't trafficking a problem in large cities only? You know, so how important is it in smaller communities? That's another big question. Also, doesn't sex trafficking happen only to girls and women? It's not really an issue for boys and men. These are questions that people have. Isn't it true that if a person agrees to be involved in commercial sex, then they can't really be a victim of trafficking? So all of these questions we're going to touch on. A couple of them I might not give you the most satisfactory answers because we don't necessarily have very satisfactory answers. Okay. All right. So what we're going to cover is, go ahead, is a little bit about the background on sex trafficking of minors, just to make sure everyone's up to date, and a little bit about safe harbor laws. So some of you may not be familiar with this kind of law that is in many states. Also, I'll tell you just briefly about the research project, the timing of it, and a little bit about the findings, a little bit about, so what does sex trafficking of minors look like in Kentucky? Before and after the safe harbor law was passed, as well as how have service providers' perceptions changed over time? And what kinds of changes are we seeing in response to the safe harbor law, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It's the Human Trafficking Victim Rights Act that was passed in 2013. And then most importantly, where do we go from here? All right, so a little bit. So sex trafficking of minors. With the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, there was a major shift with advocates beginning to raise the call of saying not only is human trafficking an issue that we need to address, but it's happening in a form that in front of people's eyes all the time, and we're not seeing it for what it is. And that's juveniles who are being exploited in commercial sex. It was known, it can be known by various names, such as teen or juvenile prostitution, teen sex works, But I want you to think about the fact that those words imply that there's some sort of choice there, which is antithetical with the idea of being exploited in trafficking. And we'll talk about why those words don't apply in this situation, and that we really need to be seeing juveniles involved in commercial sex as victims of a serious crime. All right, so the federal statute on human trafficking. First, I want to say very quickly, human trafficking is a very complex crime with many different dimensions, many different ways that it comes about and is how people are exploited. I will only be talking about sex trafficking of juveniles. So I want you to think, I'm only talking about, what happened to that slide? No. I will only be talking about what's happening in terms of juveniles involved in commercial sex. I promise you it doesn't look like that on my page. Okay, so real quickly, because everyone needs to be clear on the legal definition, because that's what begins, okay, now this is what we have legally, where do we go from there? So, severe trafficking, what is it? It's when people recruit, harbor, transport, provide, or obtain a person for, so if we're talking about labor trafficking, it's for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Force, fraud, or coercion, those are key words. With sex trafficking, we have the same definition if someone's involved in commercial sex. Force, fraud, or coercion. So they're either being physically forced, they're being forced with threats against someone they love, against themselves, they're being held captive, their documents are being kept, etc., or coerced in some other way. Or, and here's the part I want you to pay attention to, because this is relevant to our topic today, in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained the age of 18 years old. Okay? So what do we conclude from this legal definition from our federal statute? If we're talking about anyone who's under 18 years old, we don't even need to talk about whether there was force, fraud, or coercion in terms of what induced them to be involved in commercial sex. They are, by definition, a victim of severe human trafficking. That is something that blows a lot of people's minds if they're new to this topic, so I just want to emphasize this. And then the next, oh, sorry. Yeah, that's right. So just quickly, I'm not going to go over the details of the Kentucky statute, but the definition's the same. It follows not the exact wording, but the meaning's the same in terms of who is defined as a sex trafficking victim versus labor trafficking victim. All right, so that's what's important. The two laws match up. All right, the next slide will tell us just a little bit. Not everyone necessarily knows what you mean when you say commercial sex, so the federal definition in the federal law, TVPA, is any sex act for which something of value is given or received. Any sex act with something of value given or received. Often it's money, but it doesn't have to be money. It could be rent, lodging. It could be drugs. Drugs is a big one. Shelter, clothing, etc. Common types of commercial sex, so the number one that we think of would be prostitution, right? But it could also be working in a strip club, so a sexually explicit performance, peep shows, internet sex, phone sex, pornography. And these are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Often youth are exploited in multiple forms. All right, so the key thing is it's the commercial aspect that distinguishes it from other forms of sexual exploitation. It doesn't mean that the other forms of sexual exploitation are not important. It just means the statutes related to human trafficking may not apply. Does that make sense? All right, now we come to our next big question, and I told you this is one of the first ones that people ask when we start talking about this question. So how big of a problem is sex trafficking of minors? Come on, give me some stats. I need to know some stats before I care, right? And that's a good beginning place. We need to know how big of a problem this is. And you will see lots of prevalence estimates out there, ranging from 90,000 to 600,000 victims. Sometimes that's for children at risk for trafficking. Sometimes they're talking about estimates of youth who are involved in trafficking. But what I want to tell you is that they all have serious methodological problems. They are estimates of guesstimates, and it's not because the researchers are being, that they're not being conscientious or that they're trying. It's just this is a very covert problem and very difficult to identify and to get a good sense of how many people are out there. The youth, the victims that we become aware of are ones that have been identified. And we know that we are not identifying a lot of the youth because we know from the stories that survivors tell us of the many years that go on where they are being exploited and the systems that they intersect with and the people who spoke to them, the law enforcement officers, the school teachers, the counselors, who had no idea that they were being exploited in commercial sex. So that's something to think about. We want a good estimate. The fact is, we don't have a good estimate. It's really unknown. So I don't have a satisfactory answer for you for that one question, but we'll go on to some others. One thing that we do know is that 1/3 of the sex trafficking allegations opened by some federally funded task force in the US involved minors, okay? So it was minors. The next slide. So who are child sex trafficking victims? So this comes, first of all, I want to say it's very challenging to answer for the reasons that we just said. It's very difficult to identify victims until they are picked up and identified by social systems or they come forward. Most studies have found that among identified victims, females make up the majority, all right? And yet not all studies have agreed. There was a big study done in New York City by Curtis in 2008, and they found that about half of the victims were boys. Other things that we know about who are child sex trafficking victims from previous research, we know that, and to keep in mind, this is of research mainly done with individuals who've been identified by social systems. So we know that they have high rates of physical and sexual abuse. That doesn't mean everyone all of the victims have, but many. Which goes along with the fact that the majority have had prior child welfare involvement. So a lot of them have already come into contact with the child welfare system. Many of them lack family support for whatever reason. Maybe a caregiver has died. Maybe there's been some sort of separation. LGBTQ youth are sometimes thrown out of their houses or made to feel unwelcome, so they're out on the street. Many are runaways. We know that a lot of youth end up becoming involved in commercial sex after they run away from home for whatever reason. And many encounter juvenile courts in the juvenile justice system. So there are some keys here in terms of what social systems are the most important for us to look at to start identifying more of these victims. And that takes us to the next slide. Child welfare. A lot of them are already intersecting juvenile court, juvenile justice. Of course, there's also school, but I don't have a lot of data about the schools, so I'm not going to speak about that right now. What we do know is that a lot of the youth who are exploited in commercial sex, nationally as well as in Kentucky, fall through the cracks of the child welfare system. So in many states, for child welfare to become involved in a case of investigating whether sex trafficking or trafficking of any youth is happening, it had to be, the alleged perpetrator had to be a caregiver, someone in a caregiver role. That used to be the case for Kentucky before the safe harbor law that I will be talking about and that we are evaluating. So that meant that if it was a boyfriend, if it was a coach, someone else, a stranger, child welfare would say, that's not our, we're not mandated. And a lot of officers didn't know at the time, many social service providers didn't know that they qualified as victims of human trafficking. So they were being treated as juvenile offenders. Others who were not picked up for prostitution necessarily would be picked up under what we call masking charges. runaway, truancy, beyond the control of a parent, a lot of status offenses, sometimes drug charges, theft because they're out on the street, etc. All right, next slide. So one of the things that really complicates it for systems to identify victims is victims often do not self-identify as being a sex trafficking victim. And there are many complex reasons for this, and I'm just going to touch on some of the more common ones. First of all, a lot of the times they are being trafficked by someone who is using severe psychological manipulation and coercion. Oftentimes it's through the guise of a relationship, a parent. It could be a boyfriend. It could be an uncle. It could be someone, a friend, who is convincing them, the youth, that they are involved in commercial sex as part of the relationship, as part of supporting the other person, because it's glamorous, because they want to do it, because it's a good way to make money. So there's a lot of manipulation that's going on. So youth may not see what's happening to them as, oh, I'm being victimized. In fact, there might be a very good psychological reason not to see themselves in that way. That's very disempowering, right? And if you don't feel like you can get out of a situation, it's more psychologically easing to believe that you're choosing to be there. Okay, so there are lots of reasons that someone's not going to go forward and say, oh yeah, I'm a victim of sex trafficking. Another reason is fear. Fear of retaliation from the trafficker. There are a lot of severe threats, force, violence that is being used. Being told that I'll turn you over to foster care and you'll be taken from the family, you'll be arrested, you'll be deported, all sorts of horrible threats. Also, fear of not being believed. Many of these victims and survivors you will hear talk about trying to tell someone or telling someone and those people didn't believe. So after an experience like that, they're less likely to reach out for help. Mistrust. They may have had many negative experiences with authorities. As we've talked about, a lot of the kids have been involved with child welfare, have been involved with juvenile justice. And they may not have a trusting relationship to authorities. They also may just believe that no one can help or will help them. So what's the point? All right, so those are just some of the reasons that people do not identify as victims. So there are serious consequences to all of these systems not identifying victims. Number one, a lot of times the juveniles are ending up being criminalized for something for being exploited in commercial sex. So they end up in the juvenile justice system. They end up as a juvenile delinquent. Maybe for other things, or oftentimes for actions that they're taking because of their involvement in trafficking, in commercial sex. Also, when we don't properly identify victims, what happens? The exploitation continues. The psychological harm continues. Offenders are not held accountable. It just continues on and on. Also, the physical and psychological harms, STDs, unintended pregnancies, PTSD, suicidality, it goes on and on. So, long-term consequences. We know there are some very serious long-term consequences associated with being exploited in commercial sex. Especially when we're talking about youth, it will can negatively impact their future development, their sense of their self, interpersonal boundaries. It's associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, with distrust of other people, anxiety, suicidality, substance abuse, and that's a big one. And often the substance abuse is being used as exploiters to keep them in the situation. So also there are the social deprivations. For youth who are involved in commercial sex for any extended period of time, they often they're out of school, so they're not getting their education. They may not feel like they have options for employability beyond commercial sex. And then once they become involved with the criminal justice system, there are all kinds of problems that happen from that. So the advocates who started working with human trafficking victims and others who were working with at-risk youth started realizing, you know what? We're not applying the human trafficking statutes to these youth who we're picking up in Kentucky, in Pikeville, in Paducah, in Louisville, who are involved in commercial sex. And there's no reason not to. Legally, they fit the definition. Let's pursue this. And so the statutes, however, were not enough. The federal and state statutes were not quite filling the gaps. And so a lot of states, New York was the first, began to pass these laws that are referred to as safe harbor laws. So the basic element of safe harbor laws is limiting the criminal responsibility of the minors. Let's stop criminalizing youth who are involved in this crime as victims. That's the first and foremost. Other safe harbor laws, not all of them do this, but provide protective and rehabilitative services to victims once people are identified. So what does that mean? So instead of putting them in juvenile detention, let's hook them up with counseling. Let's get them safe and secure housing. Let's get them matched up with, get them back in their home if they're a runaway, if that's appropriate, or in an appropriate foster care setting. But the main emphasis behind this is to shift community responses to be in line with the human trafficking statutes that say these youth are victims of a serious crime and in need of our assistance. What changes are needed in order to be able to carry out safe harbor laws? Number one, first of all, you have to be able to identify the victims. And we already know we're not doing a very good job of that. So first and foremost, we need screening protocols. And the screening protocols, people want to know what questions to ask, and that's very important. And you want to know as few questions because you don't necessarily have people with you for very long. But more importantly, it's how to ask the questions. What approach to take with youth to try to build some rapport and some trust. It's unlikely that youth will actually tell you the first time you talk to them. So building up a relationship with repeated contacts is what seems to work best, if that's possible. Not all service providers who come into contact with a youth that they think may be exploited will have multiple contacts. Training, we need lots of training. People don't know that this is sex trafficking. They don't know it, and I won't go into all of the details, but there are many ways that it presents. It could be a parent. It could be a parent who's doing the trafficking. It could be a boyfriend. It could be a coach, etc. It could be youth out on their own doing it. Also, protective and rehabilitative interventions. People know that the agencies need a lot of collaboration in order to be able to do that. Very few agencies are able to do that, to handle everything on their own. And so there needs to be a lot more collaboration between agencies. Also, agencies needed to be more mindful of it in terms of actually having policies and protocols. And most importantly, funding. How are we going to fund special services if we don't have the money? So that's a big one, resources. Also, we need to hold offenders accountable, and that's another impetus behind the safe harbor laws. So we need to increase penalties, and we need to provide training to help with investigations, because these are often complex investigations as well. Okay, so in 2016, there were about 28 states that had enacted legislation addressing trafficking of minors. So a very small number of states mandated that child welfare agencies would be responsible for investigating reports of human trafficking of children. Kentucky is one of them with the Safe Harbor Law, the Human Trafficking Victims' Rights Act. So that's something that distinguishes Kentucky from many other states. So there's a lot on this slide, but what I want to tell you is these are the main parts of the Human Trafficking Victims' Rights Act because it's important for what comes later. Number one, it prohibits the prosecution of minors for prostitution. Prohibits. Also, it prohibits charging for and finding guilt for status offenses related to conduct associated with human trafficking. It permits court-designated workers, these are individuals who work in juvenile court, and who work with youth who are either coming in for status offenses or a first-time offense, lower-level crimes, to try to see if a diversion agreement can be worked out with them to keep them out of court. So if they're screening, they come into contact with a lot of youth who walk into juvenile court. And so having them screen for human trafficking was seen as very important, as well as juvenile justice screening. Also, the law requires that the cabinet, so the Department for Community-Based Services, Child Welfare, to provide assessment, treatment, and housing, and to do the investigation if reports are made that a child is involved in human trafficking. It also includes labor trafficking, but I'm specifically talking about sex trafficking. All right, so real quickly, the research project I did was I just happened to be doing a pilot study talking to service providers throughout the state of Kentucky in 2012 and 13. In the legislative session in 2013, the Human Trafficking Victims' Rights Act was passed. And then it was implemented in June of 2013. So I had all of this data with talking to individuals who worked with at-risk youth throughout the state of Kentucky about their knowledge, their practices, and their experiences working with youth who'd been trafficked in commercial sex. So I thought, well, let's look at them after, several years after the safe harbor law has been passed and see what kinds of changes have happened. Okay, another one. Yes. So somehow we have flipped over one, but I'll just tell you quickly. So the period I refer to as the pre-implementation period, it was 2012 and 2013. We talked to 323 service providers. So those were people, and I'll give you details about who it was. The post-implementation period, talking to individuals from the same sort of agencies, 365 key informants. And we did these interviews over the telephone, and we did, a lot of the kind of forced choice, but also open-ended, so they could give us more details about the cases. And then there's also state administrative data that I collected as part of this project that we'll talk about toward the end of the presentation. I'm going to go quickly. All right, so this one is the types of communities. The font that's in white, and you can't even see the black, can you? It looks so different on my computer screen, sorry. So about half of the individuals who had worked, who responded to our email survey the first time before the safe harbor law was passed, worked in metropolitan areas. So that was mainly the Fayette County area, Central Kentucky, Northern Kentucky area, and Jefferson area. But there were also about 1 in 5 who worked in multiple kinds of communities, and then smaller percentages that worked in micropolitan or rural. Micropolitan are basically smaller communities that aren't as small as rural, and they're usually adjacent to metropolitan communities, so like Scott County. All right, the next slide. It's a lot of information on here. I was just going to present to you the first time we did the survey in 2012 and 2013. These were the categories of the agencies of the respondents who we talked to. So as you can see, a lot of people from juvenile court, juvenile justice, victim service. And the percentages were pretty much the same. When we did the post-implementation, just a few more people from the victim service agencies. Also, so one of the questions that we first ask is, how serious of a crime do you think sex trafficking of minors is in Kentucky? And you see there was a bump in the post-implementation period with more people saying, yeah, it's a serious crime in Kentucky. However, not everyone said that. Next slide. We also asked about respondents' familiarity with the federal and state statutes on human trafficking. And when I say the statutes, I'm talking about the overall statute about human trafficking, not the safe harbor law. And there's no change. There's pretty much no change in terms of the percentage who said that they had familiarity. All right, next one. There is a big change here in terms of individuals in the pre-implementation people. Just about a third said that they had had prior training on human trafficking before we talked to them, whereas that jumped up to about 2/3 in the post-implementation period. So there are a lot of agencies out there doing a lot of training, Catholic Charities being one of the main ones. Also the question about whether an agency has a screening protocol for human trafficking. About 1 out of 5 said so at the pre-implementation period, and that about doubled by the post-implementation period. However, you can see a little less than half said that they had a protocol. Next slide. All right. Agency has a protocol for responding to trafficked minors. So you see there was an increase from like about 27% to 40% of those who said yes, but it's still a minority. It's still about 2 in 5. Next slide. Also, we know that coordination with other agencies is very important and very difficult on these cases. So we wanted to see how many of the respondents said that they coordinated with other agencies, not at all, versus sometime, versus very often or always. And we do see an increase in the percent at the post-implementation period who said that they were coordinating. However, there's still about a quarter who said not really at all. All right, next slide. So here we go. On the left side, we have the pre-implementation percentages of respondents who said that they had worked with a definite or suspected victim of sex trafficking, someone who was a minor at the time. Just a little under half said that they had worked with at least one victim. So at the post-implementation period, it was slightly smaller, but not significantly. It's like 47%. The only real difference is that in the post-implementation period, you see fewer people saying they had worked with a suspected victim. I suppose that's because with all the training, people felt a little more definite about saying, yeah, this kid was definitely involved in sex trafficking. I'm not as tentative in saying that. All right, next slide. All right. So the mean percentage of victims that they'd worked with. So this is just for the individuals who had worked with at least one victim. We asked them to tell us how many youth have you worked with that were trafficked in commercial sex. And then we asked how many of those youth were male, female, transgender, how many were a U.S. citizen versus foreign-born, etc. So several different kinds of demographics. So as you can see in both periods, the majority said that, or the majority of victims were female. However, not all. And in fact, at the pre-implementation period, 1 in 5, so 21% said 21% of the victims were male. This is a smaller percentage at post-implementation period. The other thing that jumps out, so that answers one of our questions, right, that people have. Doesn't this just happen to boys? Doesn't this just happen to girls and women? No, it doesn't. Not even in Kentucky. And then the next one is the vast majority of victims that these respondents had worked with were U.S. citizens or permanent residents. A very small percentage were foreign-born. Okay, so that answers another question that people often have about this topic. Can this really happen to youth who are born in the U.S.? Yes. When we're talking about sex trafficking, yes. All right, next slide. All right, the other thing is we were just curious about how many of them, so just because a youth is detected as being a victim of sex trafficking, that doesn't mean that the trafficking was happening in Kentucky. So we asked respondents how many of those youth were actually being trafficked in Kentucky. And you see the vast majority at both times said at least some of the trafficking was happening in Kentucky. And the other surprising finding, which unfortunately I didn't ask about at pre-implementation, but I did at post-implementation, is that just less than 60% of the victims that respondents had worked with were under the age of 16. So a lot of people think that juveniles who involved in commercial sex are 16, 17. She's basically an adult. How does that, really matter? But actually, in this survey, talking to these respondents, they were mainly dealing with younger youth. And it does matter if they're 16 or 17 because they're still a victim of human trafficking. All right, next slide. This just gives you a quick breakdown. In Kentucky, at both times, pre-implementation and post-implementation, the majority of the youth had been exploited in prostitution. Okay, sex acts in exchange for drugs or money. A good percentage had been exploited in pornography. Sometimes the pornography is used as a way to keep the youth involved in commercial sex, saying, if you don't continue working for me, I'm going to send these photos to all of your contacts on Facebook, things like that. And then strip dancing was a very small percentage of the youth. Next slide. Here's one. We asked, okay, so of the individuals who had worked with youth who were victims of sex trafficking, think about the 3 most recent cases. So if they had only one case, they would tell us about the one case. But if there were multiple, they'd tell us about the 3 most recent. And we said, what was the relationship between the victim and the trafficker in those situations? So you see there's a small percentage that say they don't know. That's like at the very end, 7 to 5%. What's the big percentage? And I was not prepared for this, even though I knew that this happens. Family members. And actually, when I don't have it on this slide, but it's like 45% said it was a parent. Okay. And then the next percentage, biggest percentage, is another known perpetrator. So meaning other than these other categories of known people, such as an intimate partner, a partner of a parent, or a friend. So there's only one category on here of stranger, someone with whom the child does not already have a relationship. So that's something to think about. Most of these youth that were working with the Kentucky service providers were being exploited, trafficked by someone known to them that they had a known relationship with. That's contrary to what a lot of people think, first off. Next slide. All right, so we also asked them and realized this is just what they may know. They may not know if there was a criminal investigation or who was charged or what kinds of charges. But if there was information that they had, we wanted to know. Did you work with any youth in which the minor was charged with was given a criminal charge? Or a trafficker or a buyer? And you see the percentages didn't change from pre-implementation to post-implementation. And a little more than half of the respondents said, at least in one of the cases they'd worked, a trafficker had been charged with any criminal offense. That's not necessarily trafficking. It could be many kinds of offenses. And very small percentages, they were aware of a buyer being charged. All right, next slide. All right, so then we wanted to get into, okay, so at the post-implementation survey, for the individuals who are working with these at-risk youth, and there's a lot of effort going into training people about how to respond more effectively and more appropriately to youth who've been involved in commercial sex. We asked how many were familiar with the safe harbor law, and we described it and named it. And as you can see, the vast majority were not at all familiar or only a little. Now, you don't have to be familiar with the law in order to be working in the spirit of it, but I just wanted to know how many are even aware of this law. The next slide. All right, so when we asked all of the service providers, and this was asked of everyone, whether they had worked with a victim or not, what is your perception of the impact of the safe harbor law? More than half said, I don't know enough to have an opinion. I really am not comfortable hazarding a guess or giving you a response. So that goes along with the idea that a lot of them weren't familiar with the law. All right. Then 2 and 5 mentioned some sort of positive impact, and we'll go over some quotes from them about what the actual positive impacts were. But they had to do with screening, with better practices, with greater interagency coordination, and with greater training. And then a smaller percentage, a little less than 40%, said, yeah, there are definitely some areas that need improvement. We could do better. And we'll talk about some of those quotes. All right, so these are a bunch of quotes about, and just some examples of some of the main themes that came out in the responses about, can you please tell me about the safe harbor law? What has the impact been? So one of the more common ones is, hey, it's made people more aware that it happens here too. It's not just happening in metropolitan communities. It's not just happening in Atlanta, New York, Dallas. There's also been a change in mentality. So a lot of people were saying, even if a lot of practices haven't changed yet, the change in mentality of seeing youth involved in commercial sex as victims is happening. There's less victim blaming. There's more compassion. people talked about, their service providers talked about being able to work together better, and making referrals and making sure that they could hand a youth victim off to someone who would actually do something with them. Also, some people talked about better access the victims had to services. So that's all good. Next slide. Also, they talked, another big one was, rather than taking them into custody in terms of juvenile justice, we're actually giving them a safe place to stay. Or having a centralized agency, i.e. child welfare, DCBS, means that there's someone responsible and someone that we can, that everyone knows to contact if they believe that sex traffic or human trafficking is happening to a child. Also, there were some mentions of courts being more willing to see victims as victims and to provide them services rather than criminalize them or put them in detention. All right, next one. So now we'll just touch a little bit about some of the challenges that the respondents said were happening after the safe harbor law. So the big one, and I've heard people talk about this, the change in having child welfare be the agency that is mandated to investigate and to respond and provide services to youth if human trafficking is suspected, is an unfunded mandate in terms of there were no more resources put into them doing this. Okay, so that's strapping or putting a lot more demand on an agency that is already short-staffed, understaffed, and doesn't have enough resources to do the job that they were doing before. So that's a big issue. Another huge issue, and this isn't just in Kentucky, this is throughout the US, is that people, once they have identified a victim and it's deemed that perhaps maybe it's not appropriate for them to go back home, either because they don't have a safe home or a family member was a trafficker, is somehow involved, there aren't many good options for safe and secure placements for youth. And we know that a lot of the youth end up running away if they're not in a more secure environment. So then many communities have had this struggle, and there are people within the community who say under no circumstances, and in fact the law says we are not to detain victims of human trafficking, we are not to put them into detention simply because we don't know where else to keep them where they're safe from the trafficker. And some people view, well, we don't have any other safe or secure placement, so it's better to keep them there, at least temporarily, than to let them out on the street and have them be victimized again. There's no easy answer. There's definitely a lot of argument for not detaining them and all of the psychological harm that comes from that. But as I said, it's a real struggle in many communities, and there are not enough safe or secure placements for youth, and runaway behavior is a huge problem. Also, mandated reporting. Some people said the fact that now I'm a mandated reporter, now I've reported it, and now the victim, the youth doesn't want to talk to me anymore, doesn't trust me anymore in my role as either a counselor or their probation officer, etc. So that's an issue, and perhaps an unintended consequence, but something that we need to address. All right, does anyone have time? Am I running out of time? Because I do have a few more slides. Oh, okay. Well, if you don't want me to go over, then I won't present the data about the screenings, the charges related to the administrative data. I don't want to take over time. Yeah, and I have a website, etc. If you go to the very last page, and you can actually download some information in it had to be 10 pages. I'm sorry, that one. There's the website. It's safeharborofminors.org, and that's the website that has more detailed information. If anyone has questions, you could ask at this point. But in case anyone doesn't have questions, I just wanted to say thank you, everyone, for your attention and interest, and that the more eyes, ears, and minds we have on this issue, the more youth we can help in getting out of this horrible situation. Thank you very much for your time. Oh, thank you. I think I'll take a water. Did I take one of yours? I took one of yours. Yeah, that's mine. I think you did take one of mine.
Oh, never mind. I got it. You're good. Thank you so much for coming from UK and speaking with us about this very insightful research. And hopefully we can see what happens in a couple of years to see what people's level of education is on this. So we are a couple minutes behind, but we will be breaking into our breakout sessions. There are 4 options for each session, all located in the various multi-purpose rooms outside these doors to the right. Each room has a sign indicating what session will be held there, and conference maps are also placed outside. Our volunteers will also help direct you if you need any assistance. After the breakout sessions, we will return here for our call to action with the survivor and closing remarks. Thank you.